Would Fadi Chahadi and Jody Halpern please join me up here? Jody, have a seat. Fadi, good to have you. So, Fadi Chahadi, sitting next to me, his title says Chairman of Chahadi and Company, which doesn't really say much. He's basically now an investor, but he's a longtime serial entrepreneur who, in my opinion, his big claim to fame is he was the CEO or president of ICANN? He was both, okay. He ran ICANN during the critical period when it was taken out of the US Department of Commerce and made into a truly international body. And ICANN is extremely unusual because it really is one of the extremely few entities in the world that has real credibility and essentially regulatory authority that is not controlled by governments but has global weight. It's hard to think of any other entity like that. Now, when that happened, Fadi essentially had to become a diplomat in order to make it happen. He spent an enormous amount of time traveling around the world, meeting with heads of state and ministers and telecom people, working inside the US too, and it was very touch and go whether the US was going to let it go. A lot of people in Congress didn't want that to happen, but he made it happen. But it gave him a perspective that is very critical for today, because that, and by the way, Esther, who's still sitting in the front row, I was going to ask her about ICANN stuff. She was the founding chairman of ICANN, chairperson. So we have another veteran ICANN expert here. But the thing that's interesting to me is we go back to the conversation I had with Andrew at the beginning, and we are really in a very strange moment of techno dystopia, possibly, at worst. But you certainly can't deny, even people who are defenders of the internet platforms recognize there is a fundamental asymmetry between the global nature of these commercial platforms and national regulation. It simply doesn't make sense, that asymmetry. Now, Fadi's been thinking about that a lot. Now, Jody, by contrast, is a professor of bioethics at Berkeley. But she and Fadi have become allies because of her work in ethics has taken her into the more IT, internet technology realm. And she's a researcher who brings together psychiatry, philosophy, behavioral economics, and decision neuroscience. I'm reading that because otherwise I'd never remember it. But she's really involved in serious issues of reform around ethics. So that's why she's here. I'm going to quickly start by asking Fadi a few questions, though, because I do think the fact that you were a diplomat for the net, in effect, and you learned certain things doing that is very critical. What have you learned, and why does it matter now?
Thank you, David. I learned that most governments do not know how the net works. And that's a good thing and a bad thing. The fact they don't understand how the digital economy functions, how the internet is enabled, makes them very nervous. And certainly when the Snowden revelations occurred in early 2013, it caused many governments to feel that they have no control over the burgeoning digital economy. And I think that made governments very nervous, and they're still very nervous because obviously the digital economy has grown, its impact on society has grown, and they still don't know how to control that. The internet, as all of you know here, is a transnational resource. It is not a national resource, or even an international resource. So I just finished work with the Secretary General on his new report on the subject, and frankly, the report comes to the realization that governments and the governance structures of the 19th and 20th century are simply inadequate to address the digital society and economy we live in. That revelation, which I had going into this, was not evident to the governments.
Well, for the UN Secretary General to say that is a big deal. That's a major change.
I mean, I was in meetings with him and the heads of all the UN agencies at an offsite he was holding, and he basically told everybody, governments and us, cannot be in charge of this new world, this new economy, and this new society. So that realization, David, is frankly both the opportunity and the problem, because today we need to guide the governance systems of the world to understand how do they participate and influence where we go from here? And we can't just ignore them. We can't assume they will just go away. They're engaged, and they're trying to figure out what role they play.
How fragile is our digital ecosystem, would you say?
It's quite fragile. It's more fragile than most of us appreciate. In my role at ICANN, for example, I was responsible for the 13 root servers that are necessary for all the core resources of the internet to find each other. There are 13 systems, 10 in the United States, 1 in Sweden, 1 in the Netherlands, and 1 in Japan. And all resolutions of searches, for example, in the world, have to somehow touch those systems. Now, the security of these systems, which was a responsibility that I shared with these other institutions, but I was overall coordinating, is actually far less robust than people think.
And without them, the whole thing grinds to a halt.
Yes.
Right. Okay. Well, so you know, because of some delays, partly introduced by me, we don't have tons of time. But Fadi, what should we do now? What? I know you and I have talked about this a lot. What is your thinking about where this should all go?
Many people have tried to move this dialogue to a new system of governance for the digital society and economy. I have come to the conclusion that we're one step too far when we talk about governance. Neither governments are ready to give up power, nor are tech companies, frankly, ready to give up power, despite their pronunciations. The reality is the power has shifted from governments to private entities, and the power struggle is so serious right now that if all we talk about is let's create a new governance system, no one wants to give up power. So with Jodi's help, I've been focusing recently on the idea of creating guardrails rather than rules and policies and laws. I think we're at the stage where I think most of us would agree, it is time for some guardrails. We need some guardrails. The guardrails on this road, this digital economy road, are frankly non-existent right now. And there is neither mechanism or general set of guardrails that we all agree to. But what's also missing, to finish the answering your question, is a platform, an institution to create the guardrails.
Yeah.
And ICANN, with the help of Esther and many of the people in the early days, was created even if those folks really didn't want to create institutions, but they had to. There had to be some place where there was agreement on how these core resources are brought together for the service of humanity. That's missing today.
Okay, we need guardrails
for the digital economy.
But the guardrails would be an interim step, presumably. We must need some kind of new institutions. You do accept that, right?
I have come to the conclusion that without some institutional framework that may not eliminate existing institutions, but rather bring them together through some coordination platform so they agree on these guardrails, I think we're going to continue facing the same issues we see today of a power struggle between those that think they have the power, governments and international multilateral institutions, and those who frankly really have the power.
Well, and it is so complicated with Mark Zuckerberg claiming that TikTok is a threat to democracy, you know, and China having a completely different approach to governance, and then Russia actually currently experimenting with a literally disconnected internet. That's the only time so far that a country has really threatened to effectively stop connecting to the rest of the world, right?
Well, the threat existed in 2013.
The threat existed, but the Russians are actually playing around with it.
And the Russians at the time had created a separate route for the internet, but they were hoping other countries would join them. And there was a real push after Snowden to take this Russian route and tie it to a BRICS route with China, Brazil, and others. And that was frankly my main project, to stop that from happening. So I worked with President Dilma Rousseff at the time, And I convinced her that this would be bad for Brazil. And once she backed off, the whole project fell apart.
That is
but
a story
Russia
in
is
itself.
bringing it back.
Russia's bringing it back now. So Jody, you believe in guardrails too, or how do you look at this whole set of issues?
Well, first of all, I mean, this is so important in the governance issues. And I think it was Fadi's image, it might have been yours, we had a conversation, was that in a certain sense, Fadi's working on the hardware, and in a certain sense, we work together, and with Nora Abusida, but in a certain sense, I'm working on the software insofar as I'm a Berkeley professor of biotech and health ethics, and I have a lot of thoughts about the content of those guardrails, the ethical content we need. And I'm trying to think, how can I say it in the 1 minute or so we have?
No, we have more than 1 minute.
Well, but I want the audience to participate.
Say what you need to say.
This is something, but the most important thing, I mean, first of all, let me just say, Fadi and I met 3 years ago at Davos. We just met because we heard each other speak, and he introduced me at that time, talking about the UN High Commissioner of Human Rights was Prince Zayed Rad Al Hussein, who's been an incredible hero. And the three of us sat there and said, how can we work towards a digital world that safeguards human rights? And that's language that is sometimes challenging in transnational organizations, but that's how I got interested. And I also do work, I have 2 big research projects on the biotech world, gene editing and ethics, and AI and ethics. But I just want to say for this audience, something I've found that tech audiences don't always know, which is that we're living with a very flattened sense of what ethics are, all of us. We're all, because we're all powerful people, and the powerful people in the world are implicit utilitarians. We all believe, and this is every tech, I've read all the guidelines of all the major tech companies, and they're completely utilitarian. They say, we care about rights and such, but if we can maximize benefit and minimize harm, then gets cast aside. So this is me being an ethics professor, but there's 2 ethical axes, and we're only operating on one, which is the utilitarian axis of where the ends justifies the means, which is if we can produce a great net benefit, we can really sort of do whatever we want. That's the harm-benefit axis, and that's happening as everyone gets into health now and tries to say we can micro-target people and get all kinds of information and manipulate their behavior because we may produce more health. That's harms and benefits, that's utilitarianism. Perpendicular, mostly not coinciding with that, is respect for human rights. Rights are not on the same spectrum as harms and benefits, and people don't seem to remember that. Yeah. And there's research showing that elites are utilitarians, people in power are utilitarians, and ordinary people care more about being treated with respect for their rights. And they say, don't manipulate me and take my rights away because you're going to produce some net health benefit. And that's why I'm in this business with Fadi, is because that's the guardrails, is we have to go back to basic rights that people have. It's not data, it's human beings' lives we're talking about. And
that was very interestingly said. So Fadi, Jody, sorry, Fadi, Jody, what would you like to see emerge as a response? You know, I mean, I keep saying institutional because we need to have some structures that we lack. And when you think about that, what do you think about?
Well, we've been working together along with Nora again on looking at where has this worked historically well. And the example, and this was Fadi's idea, was to look at pugwash and where that's the nuclear regulatory and culture and ethos that came from Einstein. You can say a lot more
somebody
about
quickly define pugwash, could you?
Pugwash was July 1957, a meeting in Pugwash, Nova Scotia. It's a town where Albert Einstein brought together many of the physicists at the time to start thinking of guardrails for nuclear technology. And in fact, most of the work that came out of Pugwash, frankly, was the ingredient that made the non-proliferation treaties of latter years. So I think we need a pugwash for the digital age. It is time. Similarly, in the 70s at Asilomar here, not far from here, Genentech and others came together to create guardrails for biotech. I think we need the same group of people from the digital industry to come together and start thinking about this, and we're hoping to host that meeting in September 2020.
You're trying to bring that together?
Yes.
And who do you want to have there, Jody? Talk
Well, that's just what I was going to say. I think, and of course, I'm a teacher. That's what I am. I'm a Berkeley professor. And so I teach the people getting the doctorates in engineering, the scientists, and I know a lot about the gene editing world that Fadi was just referring to, the
Well, and the issues around CRISPR are quite analogous.
That's my other main.
Yeah.
I've interviewed 50 of the leading CRISPR scientists, gene editing developers. And in both of those, and in digital and AI engineers, what you can see is that folks that are, because I'm also in the world of medicine and health and public health, and I've seen those fields evolve from, in 1961, I'm just add this, 92% of doctors wouldn't even tell a patient they had cancer, never mind give them any say in their decision making. I've worked in, so this field that's a field that changed and transformed itself radically. Nuclear engineering has transformed itself radically. DNA advisory did, but now we're back, I think we're backslipping. But anyway, what I think we need is that we need to educate future generations of engineers and scientists to be involved from the beginning. And in Pugwash, the scientists and the diplomats and the politicians, the representatives of various popular interest groups all work together. I'd like you to say more about that.
I'm working with Jody at Berkeley to start also a bottom-up approach. So the Pugwash is, quote-unquote, a top-down approach of bringing leaders together to think of the guardrails. But as Jody just said, we need our own engineers and scientists to also grow with a sense of responsibility. So we're starting a big project around the idea of essentially something like a Hippocratic oath for engineers and scientists that they would take as they start.
And allow me to again point to the integration of our program. Tomorrow, Konstantinos Karachalios of the IEEE will be on stage here with me.
And don't miss him.
Talking about these very same issues. He runs the standards division at IEEE, and this point of what engineers need to do differently is central to his concern.
It is.
So it's challenging, though. I think we should let the audience chime in briefly. There's so much to say, and I know we don't have time. First of all, Esther, is there anything you wanted to add to this? If you don't have to. No, I mean... Wait, get the mic, hold on.
Mic to Esther, please.
The other, I think, in a way more interesting question is ICANN really has two roles. One is the sort of engineering bottom infrastructure of the internet. Yeah. The other is the domain name system, which is really, forgive me, poorly regulated, full of corruption and sleazy marketing practices and stuff like that. And the reality is, most people now type something into Google rather than type in a long domain name. And so to some extent, the role of protecting names and trademarks and so forth is diminishing. As there are more top-level domains, the value of any particular domain name itself kind of disappears. And that's sort of the existential threat to the, quote, interesting part.
Well, what do you think ought to be done at the sort of institutional creation level, if anything, to address, but that's a sort of a sub-problem, although it's indicative of the larger problem. I mean, at the macro level, is there any movement you would like to see specifically?
To some extent, the purpose of ICANN was to fill a vacuum. It was a very appealing vacuum because people thought they could come in and grab power and run the domain name system or control content by banning domains and stuff like that. And they did a pretty good job. I'd much rather overpay for my domain name than have a government use it to silence me.
Yeah.
But where we head from now, I mean, it's really not ICANN's problem. It's a broader problem.
No, it's not ICANN's problem.
Yeah.
Right.
And so, from the point of, then we talk about Facebook and stuff like that. That's a whole different...
Well, what do you think about the idea of getting together sort of a bunch of elders to start a process? You might be one of them, in fact.
Sure. But
it'll be in a nice place, I promise.
The world is more complicated. It's easy to set up rules. The challenge is implementing them in a way. I mean, I was talking to Patrick Friedman this morning about seasteading and new sovereign states and stuff like that. The challenge is not the rules; it's fighting the corruption around the rules and the people who take advantage of them. So you.
Okay, well,
fair point.
That sounds
I'm
disturbingly difficult.
hedging on this because it ain't easy.
Well, we've got to wrap, unfortunately. We've got a very machine gun type program format, and we're going to continue this discussion in a lot of ways. Fadi's going to still be around.
Thank you.
Jody's going to be around. I hope you'll all continue this discussion. Thank you so much.